Welcome back to Wrong Sports as I get into another discontinued episode. This is where I cover college football teams that are no longer with us. In a previous episode, I covered the St. Mary's Gaels football team that was around for over 100 years, but they were also not around for like 15 years in the middle. They had a couple of breaks. This next team, though, that I'll be talking about is also from California, except they were around for 100 years, and they played Division I football. This is the story of the Pacific Tigers and their football team. But before I get to that, make sure as always you subscribe to the channel below and ring the bell so you can get updates on brand new videos that I'll be dropping in the coming weeks. Also, make sure you like this video and share this video with other college football fans. And you can check out my Patreon. You can help out the channel there. You can also check out my podcast and my social media in the description below. The College of the Pacific would open their doors in 1851 in Santa Clara, California. The school was small at first, but helped to establish a medical school in the early 1900s, and along with that was one of the first to open their doors to women as they accepted them in the late 1800s. The College of the Pacific is one, if not the oldest California college. And these firsts were just a few good things that this school accomplished, but they also accomplished a lot of great things on the football field when they would start that up in 1895. I don't have a lot of information on how they were created or who created it, but I'm guessing it was the president who wanted to have a football team because in the 1890s, football started to spread out west and eventually reach California. Early football on the West Coast was not like football on the East Coast, as it was more of a form of rugby, and the Pacific wouldn't play this early form of football long, as they only played games from 1895 to 1899, mostly playing local teams as well as their biggest rival, San Jose State. Pacific either stopped playing the sport or do what a lot of Western teams did when the 1900s kicked off, and that was play rugby, as Stanford and Cal did that before returning to gridiron football in the 1910s. Whatever the case may be, Pacific would come back to American football in 1919, and they would mostly play JV or freshman teams from either Cal or Stanford. But soon after, they would hire their first coach in 1921 as they hired Erwin Reiter. Reiter was a Stanford alum who played football on their newly reinstated team in 1917 and then again in 1919 and 1920. And as soon as he graduated, he would get his first head coaching job at Pacific at age 24. And he immediately got the school to look like most top teams at this time, as he had them running plays like Stanford had, as well as practice like his alumni team. This resulted in immediate results, as Pacific was 3-3 in their first year of 1921. Then in 1922, they would join a short-lived conference, the California Coast Conference. And this conference would have some teams that you will know about, like Fresno State, Loyola Marymount, and San Jose State. And the conference would play a conference championship. I mention that because in their first year, Pacific won all three of their conference games, and they scheduled a CCC championship game versus Fresno State in Fresno. The game unfortunately ended in a 12-7 loss, but Pacific was growing their program quickly, and this also looked like it was one of the first, if not the first, conference championship games that happened out west, or maybe even happened in America at this point. And Pacific will get even better in 1923 as they went 7-0 and 4-0 in the conference, but they could not schedule a rematch of last year's championship game. Pacific would leave the conference for another new conference, the Far Western Conference, in 1925. And this conference had St. Mary's, Nevada, UC Davis, Fresno State, and the University of San Francisco, and Pacific would struggle until 1931, when they would go 2-1-2. But so did another team in UC Davis. Since both of these teams had the same record and tied in their game that season, no one was declared the winner. But after that, a lot of things would change as Erwin Reiter would leave the school in 1932 with a record of 54, 34, and 4, but he would leave a legacy as he helped with the building of their stadium, Baxter Stadium, in 1929, which was used for the next 20 years. Coach Reiter would also follow the team and their school as they moved from the Bay Area to their current home of Stockton, California, which happened in 1923. But after Reiter left, Pacific would go out and get their most famous and probably the most famous man in all of football at that point to coach their football team, Amos Alonzo Stagg. Stagg was 70 years old at this point, but was a free agent after the University of Chicago forced him out earlier in the year, and Stagg was very annoyed by this, and I've explained this in my Discontinued episode about Chicago. You can check out a link below for that. But he would get a call from the president of Pacific asking him to head out west and continue his head coaching career. And I guess he must have also sold it on Stagg's wife at the time, because they got on a train and headed out west as Stagg would accept the job at 70 years old to become the new Pacific football coach for the 1933 season. Stagg was known as the grand old man of football, and even after he coached for over 3 decades in Chicago, he was still as smart and savvy as ever. As in his first season, he guided Pacific to a 5-5 record, but Pacific was able to get more press and attention than ever because of Stagg. In 1934, Pacific was able to do something that few teams were able to do at that point, and that was play postseason games. They played Arizona on December 7th in Tucson, which they lost, and then they played the San Diego Marine Corps on December 15th in Stockton, which they won. These 2 games were for charity, but it allowed the team to travel out of state and play some more games, which was tough for teams to do at the time. The 1935 season would bring Stagg's first winning record. They started the season almost upsetting USC, and they were 1-3-1 before they finished 4-1. That would lead into another good season in 1936, where they went 5-4-1 again, but they were 4-0 in the Far West Conference that year, so they won the conference. The next best season for Pacific under Stagg was in 1938. They would start 1-3, but then refuse to lose the rest of the season, going 6-0 to end 7-3. That was the best record for Stagg and Pacific at this point, and this season was an extra great season for Stagg, because on November 12th, Pacific would travel to Chicago to play Stagg's old team. The University of Chicago were going through some tough times at this point. After their Heisman Trophy winning running back Jay Berwanger left in 1935, they wouldn't be able to win more than 2 games in a season and started to fall all the way behind every single other Big Ten team. Again, you can hear more about this in my Discontinued episode. I'll put a link below. But anyway, this game showed how far Chicago had fallen behind Pacific, as Chicago lost 32-0 in front of 10,000 fans. In 1939, Stagg and Pacific traveled to Hawaii. First, they played the University of Hawaii, which they won, and then they played the Hawaiian Athletic Club, which resulted in a loss. This wasn't the earliest a team had traveled to Hawaii, but Pacific was one of the earliest to do so, just like how I mentioned St. Mary's. San Francisco would do it as well. A lot of teams were starting to do it, especially California teams. The 1940s, though, would hit, and Stagg was nearing 80, but he still managed to coach the Pacific to 3 straight Far West Conference titles in a row from 1940 through 1942. This was the only positive thing for these seasons, as the team ended with losing records overall in all of them. But with World War II going on, some teams would shudder, and Pacific did not, as they were bolstered by becoming a V12 school. I explained what a V12 school was in my Introduction to Service Teams, and I'll put a link below in the description for that, also above. But in summary, it kept your college open because you were able to house Army and Navy recruits, and thus those recruits were able to play on your sports teams. This would help the Pacific program in 1943, where Coach Stagg would coach them to a 7-1 record, beating UCLA, Cal, and many top service teams. Their only loss was to USC, but with 1 game left, Pacific was in line for a potential invite to the Rose Bowl. They would be playing number 9 ranked Marshfield. They only had 1 loss to Washington, but they had beaten USC. So many thought if Pacific could beat Marshfield, they would be seen as the best team out west and would go to the Rose Bowl. And Pacific was looking like they might win it, as they had a lead until half, until Marshfield took over and won 19-10. Pacific would finish the year 7-2 and miss out on the Rose Bowl, as it went to USC that year. But it was still the best season for the 80-year-old Stagg, who was also named by the Football Writers Association of America as the best coach of the year. The great run wouldn't continue though, as to start the 1944 season, they still had some great players from the V12 program, but by October, many of them were gone, and Stagg was left with a lot of undersized and less talented players. And that would be seen because the season started with them going 2-1, but once all those V12 players left, they were terrible, as they went 1-7, including getting shut out 5 times to end the season 2-8. Pacific would field a team in 1945 just as World War II ended, but they still didn't have their talent back just yet. Plus, they would play a tough schedule of 6 service teams that were still available, plus USC, UCLA, and St. Mary's. But the season wouldn't start so bad, as they did lose their first 2 games, but by less than 10 points. And then they tied a service team. But then it got really bad, as Pacific would not win a game this season, losing their last 8 games, 7 of them by shutout, and giving up an average of 30-plus points per game, giving Stagg only his 2nd winless season ever. The 1946 season would see Stagg's 14th year at Pacific and his 57th year of coaching, and it was looking like things would be getting better. That was because the war was over and many of the college-age men were back, along with high school recruits, so there would be a huge influx of talent. Some of the future standouts and important players that would come in this year were back Eddie LeBaron, tackle Don Campora, and also their QB halfback Wayne Harden. These players would help Pacific win 5 games in 1946 and get invited to the Optimus Bowl, which was against North Texas State. This bowl game was in its first year and looking to get some attention, so even though Pacific wasn't a conference winner, or had a winning record for that matter, they were invited to give Stagg another game and also get some attention. The game was a close battle, as Pacific had the lead as late as 2 minutes left in the game, but after a last-second touchdown by North Texas, Pacific would lose, and after that game, Pacific officials and Stagg would mutually agree to part ways. But Stagg was never a man to air his grievances, so even though he was once again out as a football coach, at least he was able to do it on his terms. But it was clear that Stagg wanted to coach forever, and he kind of would do that, as he would come back east to be an assistant under his son Amos Jr., who was coaching at Susquehanna University, and he would do that from 1947 to 1952. Then he would stay out west to coach punters at Stockton College from 1953 to 1958, and would officially stop coaching at the age of 96. Yes, 96, like I said, this man's a beast. He would live until the age of 102, and I feel like I have mentioned him a lot on this channel, and if you are really interested in him more, I definitely want to tell you to check out my Chicago Discontinued episode because I go over him a lot in there. But after Stagg would leave, Pacific was looking to his top assistant, Larry Siemering. Siemering was a player at the University of San Francisco in the 1930s before he would become an assistant, and was at Pacific under Stagg from 1941 to 46. Siemering was starting his coaching career with a great abundance of talent, and it showed immediately, as the team started 3-0, and they were up 20-7 versus their rival Santa Clara in Game 4 until they gave up 2 touchdowns late and would lose. That would be their only loss of the season, as they scored an average of 30 points per game, only giving up 10. Along with that, they were 5-0 in their conference, and thus they were invited to 2 bowl games, the Grape Bowl and the Raisin Bowl. In the Grape Bowl, they would play Utah State, and behind their 5'9", 17-year-old quarterback, yes, he was 17 years old, Eddie LeBaron was, they would win 35-21. Then in their next game on New Year's Day, they played Wichita State in Fresno, California, and behind LeBaron's running and passing for 2 touchdowns, they won 26-14. But it would be the start of a great stretch for Pacific, as in 1948, LeBaron was still there. Now he was 18 years old, and the team went 7-1-1, scoring 35 points per game, and they were invited to the Raisin Bowl again. This time they would play Hardin-Simmons to a 35-35 tie. To end the 1940s, they would probably have their best team. The team was still coached by Siemering, and they had LeBaron at QB. And LeBaron was getting way more press now for his speed and also passing abilities, as the team would set many records. For one thing, they led the nation in total offense, as they had 502.9 yards per game, which is insane, and they set an NCAA single-season record of 575 points. LeBaron, who played offense and defense, would also set a few records, like scoring at the school, but the season would start with a close call versus University of San Francisco, as Pacific would score first, but after 2 interceptions, they wouldn't be able to do anything else, and San Francisco would score late, but not be able to add on to it for the tie, so Pacific would hold on 7-6. After that, Pacific and LeBaron wrecked everyone, as they scored an average of 55 points, including scoring 75 points versus Hawaii and 88 points versus Cal Poly. And yeah, no one else got within about 4 touchdowns of them all season. They went 11-0, but they were not invited to a bowl game, even though the Raisin Bowl did exist this year, so did the Raisin Bowl. They might have been looking for a better bowl game, but none invited them. I'm not really sure the reason, but unfortunately, after this undefeated season, they were not able to go to the postseason. After that season, Eddie LeBaron would graduate and go on to fight in the Korean War, and then play in the NFL for 10 years. But he had a pretty incredible run for Pacific, as in his final 3 years, he led the team to a 28-2-1 record, and he did this all before the age of 20. The decade of the 1950s would bring them a couple of new things. First, it would bring them a new stadium, as Pacific moved into a permanent stadium called the Pacific Memorial Stadium. It was built after a successful fund drive which got them $165,000, and the stadium also got money from advance ticket sales. The construction would go quickly too, as it would only take 6 months, enabling the team to start playing in it in October 1950. Along with that, the 1950 season would also be historical because Pacific would have their first ever black player. Pacific was actually behind other California schools like USC and UCLA, but ahead of smaller California schools in integrating their team. Siemering one day in 1948 went to San Joaquin Delta College and saw Eddie Macon run track, and somehow convinced him to transfer to Pacific. Macon was an unknown player because he hadn't played football at the college level, and had just come back from Japan after joining the Army soon as he turned 18. But Macon would start playing at Pacific in 1949, and in game summaries of the 1949 season, he wasn't mentioned much, nor was he in the starting lineup much. But in the 1950 season, he would play a lot more, or at least show up more in game accounts. He would also team up with other backs Tom McCormick and Don Hardy to have a bruising rushing game that would rack up over 300 yards per game and average 30-plus points per game. The season wasn't as good as the 1949 season, as they finished 7-3-1, but there would be some controversy though, as in their second game they played LSU on the road, and Macon as well as the team would see how things were different in the South than in the West Coast. Macon and the team were routinely not allowed in restaurants, and the ones they were allowed in, Macon had to sit somewhere else. Macon also wasn't allowed to play in the game either, which hurt the team as Pacific lost 19-0, and this would be the first time Larry Siemering was shut out at Pacific. After that season, Siemering would leave Pacific, going 35-5-3, and was the winningest coach in Pacific history. After Siemering left, Ernie George would be elevated from line coach to head coach. George was a lineman at St. Mary's under Slip Madigan and had stayed in California to be a high school coach. In 1947, Siemering hired him to be the line coach, and since the rushing attack was rated in the top 10 in the 1949 and 1950 season in all of the NCAA, he was picked to be the head coach. And George would continue to do what he knew best, which was run the ball, as he would run the ball now with Macon and Tommy McCormick, and have a really good quarterback in Doug Scoville. The team would regress record-wise, as they were 6-4 this year, but they had another top 10 rushing attack, as well as have a 1,000-yard rusher in Tom McCormick. The team was invited to play in the Sun Bowl against Texas Tech on January 1st. Both teams were 6-4, but this game would become historical, as Eddie Macon would suit up and play, making him the first black player to play in the Sun Bowl. Unfortunately, Pacific would lose, but Eddie Macon would make history there, and he would graduate after the season and be drafted by the Chicago Bears, but play mostly in Canada, as well as play on the inaugural season of the Oakland Raiders. Year 2 under Coach George would be a lot of the same, as they had another top 10 rushing attack, and Tom McCormick was a top 5 scorer in the NCAA, as he had 13 touchdowns. The rushing attack was dangerous again, as George would hire a Pacific alum to be the new line coach. His name was Wayne Hardin. Hardin had the tough task of coaching up the line so they could do what they did last year with Macon. The team would be 7-3-1, and they would go to the Sun Bowl again in 1952, where Pacific would win, giving them their final bowl win. After the season, Ernie George would leave to be an assistant in the NFL, and so would some of his other assistants at Pacific, like Wayne Hardin, who went to the Navy. So instead of being able to elevate Hardin like they had in years past since he was the line coach, they would go out and hire another former assistant in Jack Myers. Meyer was a QB running back at UCLA after World War II, then played for the Eagles until 1950. And when he thought he was done playing, he took an assistant job with Pacific in 1951, until the Rams called him for the 1952 season. That was only short-lived though, as he was open to coming back to Pacific, and when the head coaching job was open and nobody else was around to beat out Myers for the job, he was in at the age of 29 to be the Pacific coach for the 1953 season. When Myers came in, he changed up the offense from a running attack to a passing attack. This did result in a shocking opening season win over Stanford, but they didn't really have any other big wins for the rest of the season and would end at 500, but they did have the second best passing attack in the NCAA. The next 2 seasons under Myers were learning experiences as the team again got to 500, but nothing really else of value would happen until next year. Coming in 1956, Myers would have a player that would gain the nickname of the one-man show. His name was Dick Bass. He was extremely talented coming out of high school as he ran for over 3,500 yards and scored 68 touchdowns, including a state record 37 in 1954. He would make people on campus talk as he was a freshman in 1955, and also would have some dazzling runs to start the season for the 1956 season. Along with Bass, they also had a future Super Bowl head coach and quarterback, Tom Flores. Flores would have the second best completion percentage in 1956. All of this would result in Pacific having a pretty good record of 6-3-1, but they wouldn't be able to build on this in 1957 as Bass was injured for some of the season, so instead they went down to 5-3-2. When 1958 started, Pacific would have one of their most powerful teams, and they would show it in their first game, as Dick Bass was back from injury and he would run for over 200 yards as Pacific beat Cal. And this was pretty significant because Cal would go to the Rose Bowl this year. Dick Bass would also have an incredible season leading the NCAA in scoring, rushing, and all-purpose yards as he had over 1,400 yards. Bass would get some Heisman votes as well as leading Pacific to a 6-4 record. Bass would play 9 games in 1959 but only have half the stats he did in 1958. Pacific would be 21-11-3 and he would rush for 2,700 yards, 31 touchdowns, and 3,000 yards of total offense during the 3 years he played. But now we're in another new decade of the 1960s, and there would be some changes to kick off this decade again, as in 1961 they changed their name from the College of the Pacific to the University of the Pacific, but that change would just be a precursor for a bunch of divisional changes for the football team. They would start playing football at the University Division, then went down to the College Division for the 1960 season. The team would change again in the late 1960s as they went back up to the University Division before finding their first conference in the Pacific Coast Athletic Association. I'm not sure why all the changes were done, but Jack Myers was the coach and was also the athletic director until 1961. Then Paul Stagg took over. He would only be the athletic director, and that name would sound familiar because he was the son of Amos Alonzo Stagg. So Stagg may have wanted to get the team placed in the University Division to get them into a conference, so that might have been why he pushed for another divisional change. Along with a few athletic director changes, there were also 4 coaches during this decade and only 3 winning records. And fun fact, all 4 of these coaches were all Pacific alums, with the best coach during this decade probably being Doug Scoville. The former Pacific quarterback took over in 1966 and coached until 1969 and had 2 winning seasons. The best being his final year when they went 7-3 in their first year in the PCAA. The 1970s would bring the team some stability, as they were now in the PCAA for the entire decade and would only have 3 coaches during that span. And I'm going to be covering one coach in particular more than the other 2 because he was there for most of the decade. But they would start the decade with Homer Smith, who would only go 8-18 during his 2 years at Pacific. But then Pacific would go out and hire their best coach that decade in Chester Caddis. Caddis was a top defensive assistant at Pacific since 1968. He was hired by Scoville and then proceeded to head a defense that had a great 1969 season. Caddis didn't get the head coaching job in 1970, but stayed with the new head coach Homer Smith. When Smith would leave, Caddis was finally elevated and proceeded to turn Pacific into an even better defensive team. I say that because in Coach Caddis' first season of 1972, the team finished with the most wins by a Pacific football team since their undefeated 1949 year, as they went 8-3. Along with that, they finished 5th nationally in rushing defense, and also on the offensive side, they finished 12th nationally in rushing offense with 265 rushing yards per game. but unfortunately lost late in the season to San Diego State, which ruined their chances of winning the PCAA title. Also, one more thing about this season was that on the defense, Pete Carroll, yes, that Pete Carroll, the Super Bowl winning head coach, played on that 1972 team and then would stay on as an assistant from 1973 to 1976 under Caddis. And the team would follow up a really good 1972 season with another winning record in 1973, and the defense would also be ranked first for fewest total yards allowed in the entire NCAA. And I mentioned how their offense was ranked in the top 15 for rushing offense. That was because they had Willard Harrell. He was a 5'8", 160-pound running back that ran for 1,300 yards and 15 total touchdowns, plus he led the NCAA in all-purpose yards in the 1973 season. This allowed the offense to score 28 points per game and then win 7 games. But after those 2 really good seasons, Caddis would continue to coach until 1978, but wouldn't win that many games, as the best season he could get was a 6-5 record. And that 6-5 record in 1977 would be significant, because for the next 15 years, they never had another winning record. After Caddis would leave, Pacific would hire a well-known coach from the Bay Area. His name was Bob Toledo. You might know Toledo because he coached in the Pac-10 for a couple of years, but before this, he was from the Bay Area and coached UC Riverside in 1974 and 75, going 15-6 and winning 2 California Collegiate Athletic Association titles. Toledo, though, wouldn't be able to do anything sort of that when he was at Pacific, as they went 18-30 from 1979 to 82, with the best record he could get was 5-6. Up next on this coaching carousel was Bob Cope. Cope was a well-known assistant at Pacific from 72 to 75, and he was also a defensive-minded coach too. He came in to try and get Pacific back to glory, and to also try and stop the high-powered offenses that were all over the PCAA. Cope, though, was not able to do that, as the defenses would give up 25 points or more, and their offenses weren't great either. In summary, Cope made it 6 seasons. Yes, he made it 6 seasons somehow, from 82 to 88, and their best record was 5-7. One notable player, though, to play for Cope during this time was Hugh Jackson. Jackson played on the 1985-86 team, throwing for over 2,500 yards, and he would also rush for just under 900 yards, leading to 2 of the best offensive years for Pacific during the 1980s, but unfortunately their defense was not good, so they were 9-14 during Jackson's 2 seasons. Cope, though, would leave in 1988, which was also the same year the PCAA changed its name to the Big West Conference. It would also bring in a new head coach to the sidelines in Walt Harris. And Harris, like most of the coaches Pacific would hire, played for Pacific in the late 1960s. He was then an assistant at Pacific from 1971 to 73, and just before he took the Pacific job, he was at Tennessee as their offensive coordinator, so he was coming back to his alumni to try and turn around this team. Walt Harris' first season was a real struggle, as they went 2-10 and losing their games on average by 20-plus points. But then the Pacific under Harris would get a lot better when the 1990s started. So much so that in the 1990 season, the offense would score 30-plus points, which was a vast improvement. But unfortunately, their defense was dreadful, as it gave up 40 points per game, so the team would only be 4-7. The 1991 season was even crazier, as they scored 40 points or more in 6 games, but once again the defense was awful, and they would lose 2 of those games, and also on average give up 40 points per game over the whole season, so Pacific would finish again at 5-7. But I mean, with an offense like that, they really should have had a winning season, as their quarterback had the most passing yards in the NCAA, and he also threw for 37 touchdown passes. Plus, they had the top wide receiver in the NCAA in Aaron Turner, who had 92 catches for over 1,600 yards and 18 touchdowns. But the best player on their offense wasn't even those 2 guys. It was Ryan Benjamin, who was a 2-time Big West Conference Offensive Player of the Year in 1991 and 92, and led the nation in a couple of stats in those years. but his best season was that 1991 season, as he caught 50 passes and rushed for 1,500 yards, and he led the NCAA in all-purpose yards with 2,995 yards. Walt Harris would also leave after that prolific year of 1991 to be an NFL assistant and coached at Pitt and Stanford in the 2000s. Chuck Shelton would be hired next as the head coach, and he was so different from any other Pacific coach because he never went to Pacific and he was never an assistant there either, so he was a complete outsider. Shelton did know, though, of Pacific, as he was a head coach at Utah State before this, and they used to play a lot. But he wasn't blowing people's minds at Utah State, as they never had a winning record under Shelton, but he was somehow hired at Pacific for the 1992 season. And in that season, he would still have Ryan Benjamin, and even with his 2,500 all-purpose yards, and the defense giving up 10 less points per game than in 1991, they still would finish with a losing record. They would see a one-game improvement in 1993, just getting closer and closer to that 500 season, and then in 1994 would finally break their 16-year-long streak of losing records as they finished with a 6-5 record and a 4-2 record in the Big West Conference. And that was a first for that too. Even though they had finally reached a winning season, they were seeing a lot of changing around them. For one, a lot of California schools had dumped football, like Cal State Fullerton. Most of these schools dumped football due to rising costs, or not having a home stadium, or not having the money to keep their football team at the level of their basketball program. I usually mention that as one of the main issues for a team dumping their football program, but Pacific never really had that issue, as they had a home stadium, they were still drawing in some people, but their fan base was starting to shrink, and the losing seasons didn't really help that fan base. But going into the 1995 season, they were coming in off of a winning record, and they would see a minor upset to start the season, as they beat Pac-10 team Oregon State. Yes, Oregon State were not the best, but Pacific had not beaten a Pacific 10 team since 1983. They would also start the Big West Conference schedule going 2-1, but after a 2-point loss to New Mexico State at home, they would lose their final home game the next week versus conference champion Nevada. Pacific would give Nevada a game, but they couldn't outscore them, and they would end their season at a 3-8 record. Towards the end of the 1995 season, you could hear some rumblings that something might be happening on the campus, and it was no less than 1 month after their final loss that the university board would vote to disband the football team for at least 1 year. Yes, very rare that it was only for 1 year. But Pacific was the only private school in the Big West Conference. That may have been a big concern because the Pacific president would come out and say that dropping football at this time is recognition of the fact that there is a $400,000 shortfall, and the elimination of this program would reduce the likelihood of an additional shortfall in the future. Basically, he was saying, hey, let's drop this football team for a year and see if we can make it up next year. But we all know that that would never happen. There were no real other news or stories that have come out about the school possibly bringing back a football team either, and the thought of it coming back was pretty much mute when the university announced in 2012 that it would close Stagg Memorial Stadium to conduct a feasibility study to assess needed repairs, upgrades, and changes required to make it modern. The study was also done to see if it would be financially feasible to do those upgrades. After about 2 years, it was found it wasn't feasible. So the university began removal of the stadium, which they changed to Stagg Memorial Stadium in the late 80s. And I didn't mention this before, but they changed the name to Stagg Memorial Stadium in the late 80s to obviously commemorate Amos Alonzo Stagg, and now it was no more than 25 years later that they were going to remove the stadium. On February 24th, 2014, they would do that, the stadium would be removed, and now a new athletic center, not named after Amos Alonzo Stagg, currently stands there. So in summary, the Pacific Tigers football team may have been one of the longest teams to stay around that really don't get enough coverage. They not only had the grand old man of football, Amos Alonzo Stagg, for over a decade, but they also had some great teams like the 1949 team and the 1972 team, plus those prolific offenses in the early 90s. And they also had a record of 346, 403, and 24 with a 46% winning percentage, which again isn't great, but certainly not terrible considering this team went 16 years between winning seasons. But the school produced a lot of memorable seasons. It also produced a lot of memorable players and also 2 Super Bowl winning coaches. So a lot came from this school, which is pretty incredible. Anyway, thank you so much for hanging out with me on this journey as I go over another discontinued program. This time, it was the University of Pacific Tigers. But before I go, I have to tell you once again to make sure you like this video and share this video with other college football fans. And as always, please subscribe to the channel below. Check out my Patreon. I also have a link for my social media and my podcast. It's all available in the description below. Have a fantastic rest of your day.